Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'll be painting this Wisteria scene. This is inspired by the view that I saw last spring when I was over in Graz, Austria, and it was Wisteria season. So this is what it looked like. I really like the elements of the light and the texture of the rough brick wall contrasting the Wisteria draping down from the top. However, I prefer purple Wisterias, which they had at a different spot, so I'll be combining them in my painting. So for the sketching portion, I just drew out the outline of the light, which is fairly simple. This is just to ensure the spacing of the composition. I started from the top with a circle, then I found the center point and ruled it straight down with a ruler. Then I found the left and right side, making sure that it's aligned with the round bulb. And I also added some angled surfaces for the top of the stand holding the light. Then I also really lightly sketched out where I want the flowers to end in the composition. Once I'm done with the sketch, I'm going to mask off the light area that I drew out. For the larger spaces, especially for the stand, I just use my washi tape that I cut down into the same width as my sketch, which ensures the straight line going down. Then I use my washi tape to cover the center of the circle, finished off with my masking fluid to cover the rest of the area. I'm also using my silicone brush to make it easier to move the masking fluid around with a bit more accuracy. Once everything is covered, I want to make sure everything's completely dry before I paint on it, but meanwhile, let's go over the colors. Firstly, this is Vermilion by Holbein, Terre Verte by Holbein, Jaune Brilliant Dark by Schmincke, Prussian Blue by Holbein, Permanent Yellow Deep by Holbein, Rose of Ultramarine by Daniel Smith, and I'll also be using Bleedproof White by Dr. P.H. Martins. Now let's begin to paint. I'm starting by dampening the surface with my large brush. I'm only dampening the area of the flower, which I'm going to paint first, and I'm only doing this very lightly and making sure that the surface is fairly even. Now working on the damp surface, I'm going to start with a Jaune Brilliant Dark, and I'm placing down the colors, basically spacing out the areas where I want to paint in the flowers and separating it from the area of the leaves. I'm using Jaune Brilliant Dark because it's a fairly light color, and I'm also using a light consistency here, so it's going to be light enough that the purple that I'm going to paint on top won't be contaminated. Once I have the flowers spaced out, I'm going to add the greeneries. For this, I'm using a mix of Permanent Yellow Deep and Terre Verte. And just like before, I'm going to place it on the damp surface in between the Jaune Brilliant Dark. To add a bit of variation and also a bit of depth for the shadows, I added a little bit of Prussian blue into the mix so you can see some darker green as well. This time I'm also using a slightly thicker consistency to paint in between the flowers so you can see a clear separation. For this, I also switched to my smaller synthetic brush so I have a little bit more control. And I'm also thinking of the texture of the leaves, even though I'm painting on the damp surface. I found that the surface was still a little bit too damp for me to add the two tones, so I ended up just sticking with the light yellow-green first. Then once I've covered enough area, I'm going to go back to the darker green by adding more Prussian blue. This time though, I also added more Terre Verte and also a bit of vermilion to make the color look a little bit more muted and natural. As you can see from the reference image, the area on the right hand side has a bit more shadow, so I'm just going to leave it for now and move on to paint the flowers. For the mixture, I'm using Rose of Ultramarine. I'm just going to refer it as purple since it's much shorter and easier. I also mixed it with a little bit of Jaune Brilliant Dark using a thin consistency and creating small random brush strokes until I create somewhat of a triangular silhouette to represent the flowers. Then at the bottom, while the surface is still damp, I added more purple into the mixture or the ratio, so the value is slightly darker, and this also creates a nice natural gradation. From the previous color mixture, you can play around with the ratio, creating something that's a little bit more pinkish or a little bit more purplish. Or if you want a deeper purple, you can also add in some Prussian blue, which I'm doing for the flowers that I placed behind the previous ones I've painted. I'm still using the same method though, using a slightly thinner consistency to create the silhouette and the random brush strokes. Then once I reach the bottom, I use a darker value in a slightly thicker consistency. Hopefully from here you can start to see the flowers take shape, and I'm just going to repeat the same method to paint the rest of the flowers, which will be very repetitive but also very relaxing and satisfying, especially when we watch the damp paint mingle with each other. As a tip to keep the composition looking natural, I like to play with the length of the flowers. So some are longer than others, and I also use a medium to light brush load when painting these. So when you apply the paint, it doesn't puddle up and travel uncontrollably. If the paint on your brush is too heavy, it usually is almost dripping. Don't forget to take the excess off by dabbing off the extra paint on tissue or paper towel. Another way to do this, if you feel like the flowers in front are not dry enough for you to add the deeper purple flowers in between, you can paint several sections before going back to the first one, so the paint has a bit more time to settle when you see that the paint is no longer too wet and glossy. Sometimes I like to also go back to the flowers at the bottom to add more flowers behind and under the ones I've already painted in a thinner consistency to depict a bit more depth. So now I'm just going to keep adding more flowers until I fill in the rest of the empty spots. I feel like I have a good amount of flowers here, so I'm going to move back to paint the leaves, or at least fill in the rest of the space where it's still a little bit white, and I'm going to bring a little bit more green closer to the flowers that I've previously painted. Next, I'm going to start adding more details to the flowers. Here, I'm adding more of the layers behind the ones that I've previously painted. And I'm also going to use darker values to add a little bit more form and separate some of the flowers if I feel like some of them are blending together too much. I'm also now painting on a dry surface, so you can see the dots or the textures that I'm making have sharper edges. I feel like the leaves near the light looks a bit too dense, so I decided to use a mix of vermilion and permanent yellow deep as orange to break up the green slightly. And here I used the same yellow-green mix to paint the shapes of the leaves on top of the dry light green background. I tried to imagine the direction where they're growing and paint on single-stroke leaves growing out of each small stem. I generally paint loosely, but I like to be a bit more careful as I reach the edges of the painting so the elements can help frame the painting a bit nicer. Next, I'm going to move on to the bottom section where I'll be painting the brick wall. Just like the flowers earlier, I decided to start by dampening the surface so I can cover the whole area fairly quickly. For some of the loose tones, I used the light yellow-green mix with added Prussian blue, and I also added some of the purple mixture until I reach a warm green tone, and I'm just going to place them randomly on the left with a medium consistency and just letting the paint spread on its own. As for the brick, I used the same mixture with added vermilion and permanent yellow deep, so the orange is slightly muted. I'm just going to place it in between the stones and also painting the rest of the right-hand side. Next, I want to add a bit of shadows underneath the flowers. This is to separate the background with the flowers. So I created the orange mixture from vermilion and permanent yellow deep, and I added some Prussian blue and also the purple that I've previously mixed on my palette. The surface should still slightly be damp, but not as wet as before, and I like to use a medium to thick consistency, and as I get closer to the flower, I added more Prussian blue for an even darker color. However, since the light is coming from the left, I like the shadow to be a little bit warmer, so I added more vermilion. I felt like there weren't enough contrast, especially for the shadows underneath the flowers near the light. So again, I added more Prussian blue in that area so the light colors of the flowers can pop out a little bit more. Next, I'm going to add shadows to the greeneries. Here, I just used all the colors that I've already pre-mixed on my palette, and I just basically added more Terre Verte. And of course, you can adjust it by adding either more Prussian blue or permanent yellow deep depending on the tone. I like to add the darker valley green right under the flowers, again for more contrast. And for this area, as I mentioned earlier, I want to break off the green slightly, so I added some vermilion into the browns that I've already pre-mixed, so it looks like a little bit of the background is showing through. I want the edges to be fairly soft though, so I used a clean damp brush to smudge the edges because I don't want this area to have a sharp definition. Next, I want to add some textures to the stone. You can see some browns that I've already pre-mixed on my palette. And this is a little bit of a yellow brown that I paint on a dry surface. You can see that the edges are very sharp, but then I went back in with a clean damp brush to soften some of the edges. So some lines are a little bit more harsh and others are blending into the background. As for the details of the brick wall, I use the same mixture with added vermilion, and you can also mix in some permanent yellow deep if you want it to be a bit more yellow. And I first use a light consistency to paint the brick texture before smudging more of them, especially for the darker areas near the flower and on the right hand side. Of course though, for the darker areas, I use a slightly thicker consistency. Here I just added more vermilion since there's already a lot of brown that I can pick up to mute the vermilion. Here I'm using a thicker consistency to paint some of the brick texture on the right, but I ended up covering it with the light yellow brown. I just felt like that area needs to be darker in general, so after covering it while the surface is still damp, I added more vermilion into the previous mixture and I painted on more of the brick textures very loosely. There's also a lot of contrast compared to the left, so I brought over some of that darker value to the left. After this, I'm going to redefine some of the stones and the brick texture. Generally, you can create brown by using all of the colors here. You can think of opposite colors like red and green or purple and yellow, and play around with different ratios of the hues depending on the tone that you're looking for. So here I'm just using a light to medium consistency of the browns that I have on my palette to redefine some of those brick and stone textures. The surface here is still a little bit damp, so you can see on the drier surface the edges are a little bit more sharp, whereas on the right hand side, if it's still a bit damp, you can see that the edges kind of blur out. Next, here I'm going to take off the mask areas, but before you do this, you have to make sure that everything is completely dry so you don't accidentally rip off some of your painting. Now, as for the light, I used a mix of Prussian blue and vermilion to get a neutral gray. I use a thin consistency to paint the right, and on some parts of the left, I like to create a little bit of variation by adding more vermilion in the ratio so the gray is a little bit warmer. While painting this, I like to leave out some white negative spaces, following the curvature of the circle to make sure it looks very rounded and also glossy in texture. While the surface is still damp, I also like to add in a slightly thicker consistency on the bottom right, but if the surface is too damp and I feel like the light or the circle can't take any more color, I'm going to leave it to dry and paint another area, as I'm doing here. For the bottom of the lamppost, I use a thicker consistency of the same gray, and I also again left out some white space so it looks glossy and almost black. Then for the stand itself, I used the same mixture. I painted using a thicker consistency on the right hand side since it's in shadow, and I made sure to use a lighter consistency on the left. Now going back to the round lamp, I decided to layer on some of the warmer gray at the bottom. Then on the right hand side, I use a slightly thicker consistency. After this, I want to redefine the surrounding area to make sure that the light posts stand out a bit more. So here I'm increasing the darker value on the greeneries behind the light. Once I've painted all of the features, I'm going to increase the detail of the flowers and the leaves. I first use some bleed-proof white with a light purple mixture, and I use a medium consistency that is slightly transparent to paint on top of some of the flowers, creating a dotting motion following the growth of the flowers. Since the color is lighter and will stand out against the darker background that we previously painted, the lighter detailed flowers should depict ones which are placed in front, and I'm going to distribute them around the areas I've painted. Be careful to not overdo this because we don't want everything to look too cluttered. What I'm trying to create is a nice contrast for the background versus a more detailed texture for the flowers and elements in front. In some areas, if I feel like the bleed-proof white ended up flattening the flowers, I will still use that same mixture but with added purple, so I create something that's a little bit more opaque but darker in value to add to the bottom part of the flowers so it still has that nice transition. For this finalization, I also want to increase the darker values behind the lighter flowers. So here you'll see me using the bluish purple, which has more Prussian blue in the mix. And after this, I'm also going to balance out and increase the darker values of the leaves. At this point, do what feels right to your composition because it will probably be at a different stage than mine. The overall aim here is just to make sure I have enough contrast between the values and all the areas are fairly balanced. Since I've added details to the flowers, now the leaves need to have some of those details as well. So here you can see me mixing up that green with added bleed-proof white to add on some lighter leaf details. Again, I'm doing this very sparingly because I don't want it to look too cluttered. And lastly, I want to really increase the value for the shadow underneath the flowers. I like to also vary the tone, so here I added some purple as well. And I tried to somewhat duplicate the texture of the flowers, so the background looks a little bit more interactive and interesting. With a mixture of light purple and bleed-proof white, you can also add more flowers wherever you need to. Here, if I see certain areas look a little bit too flat with the greens, I will just break it up by adding more flowers. After this, I just want to make sure everything is balanced, so I'm just going back and forth in certain features whenever I find certain things need little touch-ups. But that's basically it for this painting. This was so much fun for me, and somehow I feel more comfortable painting in this style, and I hope to keep improving. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section, and if you enjoyed this tutorial, don't forget to subscribe for more tutorials. Like usual, the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in the description box. Thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Bye!